Chapter 25, Obligations and Performance. What buyers and sellers are expected to do in a contract. When we began this semester, we first looked at the types of contracts that sellers enter in order to move their goods to their eventual buyers. Those were our bailment contracts. After we got our bailment contracts in place, we looked at the type of language that sellers and buyers insert into their contracts to determine who would bear the risk of loss, the insurable interest, and the title to those goods while the goods were in transit. Then we moved to the body of law provided by the UCC that provides warranties over the goods once they reach the buyer. Now we're going to look at more specifically the duties that buyers and sellers each have as it relates to their contract. Their duties would be and their performance. The general principles. First of all, the UCC imposes on all parties an obligation of good faith. This concept of good faith requires that everyone be working together, working towards the same goal, and that we're being honest and above board with each party. You may recall from legal environment that we learned about this concept of fraud. That's when one person makes a false statement of fact with the knowledge that it is false, with the knowing that it's false, or with reckless indifference to the truth. So fraud would be diametrically opposed to good faith. So if a party entered into a contract and they were able to figure out or prove that the other party had committed fraud, they'd also be able to sue them for breach of this concept of good faith, because good faith requires that you are operating in an honest and professional manner. Time for performance. The time for performance really depends upon the type of contract that you have. If you have a cash transaction, then the duties of the buyer and the seller happen at the same time, concurrently, and they typically happen at the moment the contract is entered. A good example of this is the contract that occurs when we go to Target. When I go to Target and I buy towels, and I get in the line, typically I'm using cash. And even if you're using credit cards, that's still in this context considered a cash transaction, because payment is going to be given at the time that the goods are received. So at that moment, the duties of the buyer are to pay. I give my debit card, I give my credit card, or I give legal tender cash. And the seller's duty is to deliver those goods to me at that moment. And deliver in this sense is not to actually ship them, it's just to give them to me. Our duties are concurrent. In a non-cash transaction, there may be time between the moment the contract is entered and when the goods are bound to be delivered to me, if there is delivery, and there may be time between when I actually have to pay. For example, if you're Target purchasing from Samsung, you might enter into a contract that's for Samsung to provide goods over a 3-year time period. So there's a lapse of time between when the contract is entered and when the buyer, Target, receives the goods. There also may be a lapse of time as to when Samsung, the seller, receives payment from Target. If I'm buying goods over a 3-year period, it is likely that I am going to pay those goods in some sort of installment plan or financing arrangement. So there would be a lapse of time between when the contract is entered and when my performance of paying and the seller's performance of providing the goods takes place. Now, as you intuitively know, under a contract, the main duties are for the seller to furnish whatever is being sold, what the goods are, and for the buyer to pay for the goods. If either party fails to execute their part of the contract, this is considered a breach or a repudiation. Your book terms this a refusal to perform a contract. I'd say that word is too strong. It's not just a refusal. It doesn't have to be a refusal. Just a failure to perform under the contract. I fail to pay. I don't have the money to pay. My money, the form of payment I use, bounces and does not clear. That is a breach on the part of the buyer. Even though that might not be an actual refusal on their part, it's more of an inability. Conversely, the seller, how might they fail to perform under a contract? They may not get the goods in time. They may have a supply chain problem where they don't get all of the pieces that they need in order to manufacture the good that they are selling you. That would be a failure on the seller to perform under the contract. That would be considered a breach. Typically, most contracts have a time for performance. Target orders 100 cases of goods from Samsung. They're due April 1st. If on April 1st, Samsung doesn't get the goods to Target, there's been a breach of the contract. That breach occurred at the time of performance. But sometimes a party knows in advance that they will not be able to perform their part of the contract, and they let the other party know that they won't be able to perform. So if Samsung lets Target know on March 15th that it won't have the 100 cases by April 1st, that is what's considered an anticipatory breach or an anticipatory repudiation. They're synonymous. An anticipatory breach is when a party lets the other party know ahead of time that they will not be able to perform their part of the contract. You might wonder, why would anybody do that? Like, why are you letting them know ahead of time? And a good reason you would let the other party know ahead of time is because the party that won't get what they are expecting would have times to make alternate arrangements. For instance, if Samsung lets Target know you're not going to have 100 cases by April 1st, that gives Target 2 weeks or a few weeks ahead of time to find another seller to get the products. Or Target might decide, you know what, we don't need 100 cases by April 1st. Can you give us 50? Can you give us 30? We can give you an extension of time. We only really need 20 cases by April 1st, so long as you deliver the balance within a reasonable time frame. So there are good commercial reasons for why a party would let the other one know that they are going to breach and to do it ahead of time so that some other arrangement could be worked out. Conversely, a buyer may not have the financing in place to purchase goods that they had already entered into a contract for. Maybe Target lets Samsung know, we won't have our full payment that's due on April 1st, but we'll have half. Would you be willing to take half payment for half shipment? Or would you be even more gracious and take half payment for the full shipment and take us at our word that we'll pay you the rest within a reasonable time? Don't know if that'll work, but if the buyer suggested that gives the seller time to make decisions. So that's why in a commercial context, it is often a good idea to let the people you're contracting with know that you won't be able to perform under the contract. Sort of the opposite of an anticipatory breach is a demand for adequate assurance. When you make a demand for adequate assurance, this is a situation where you believe the other party won't be able to perform under the contract. And the time for performance isn't due yet, but you want to know if that other party will be able to perform in time. So let's take our Samsung Target example. Target needs goods by April 1st. But let's say they have learned from reading some financial trade journals or following up, with Moody's that Samsung has entered bankruptcy. And when a company enters bankruptcy, parties who are in contracts with them, first thing they will wonder is, okay, will they be able to perform? Will they have the money to give me my goods, or will they have the money to pay, or whatever the issue might be? So if Target has reason to believe that Samsung is having financial difficulties or supply chain difficulties or manufacturing problems or any reason why Samsung wouldn't be able to deliver the goods, they could make what's called a demand for adequate assurance. Now, a party is only going to do this if they have some, reasonable information that they are going on that makes them think that they should request this. You don't go around making demands for adequate assurance just in general contracts. It's because you have some rational information, rational basis to base this on. Once requested, the other party must give you some adequate reassurance that yes, they'll be able to perform. So once Target makes a written request, demand for adequate assurance to Samsung, Samsung would need to respond, typically within 30 days, and make a clear assertion that yes, we'll be able to have you the goods by April 1st. If they don't, if the party who has received the written request for demand of adequate assurance, if they don't respond to that demand and give reassurance that they can perform, the other party can treat the failure to respond to that demand for adequate assurance as a breach in and of itself. So even though Samsung wasn't required to get the goods to Target till April 1st, once Target sends the demand for adequate assurance to Samsung in writing, and Samsung doesn't respond within 30 days saying, yeah, we still are going to be able to perform, Target can call that a breach and call the contract over and pursue its remedies for breach. We're going to talk about remedies in Chapter 26, but that's what that will allow it to do. So you have to take a demand for adequate assurance seriously and respond to it if you receive one. Now we're looking at Roman numeral 2, duties of the parties. Seller. What are the seller's typical responsibilities under a contract? Mainly, they need to deliver the goods or whatever has been ordered. So the seller has a duty to deliver. Deliver in this sense does not mean ship. It does not mean the seller has to ship the goods to the buyer. Remember, we talked about that. The UCC does not impose a duty on the seller to ship. If you want shipping, that has to be in your contract. In this sense of deliver, we mean the seller has to make available the goods that have been purchased. So I want you to make sure that you understand that distinction. This deliver does not mean to ship, it means to have the goods available. The place, time, and manner of delivery is typically going to be in the contract. The parties would have bargained for that. If there's going to be shipping, then they would have the place, the time for delivery, and in what manner. Is it being FedExed? Is it going to be airdropped? How it's going to be delivered, if delivery is part of the contract. If the parties fail to put place, time, and manner of delivery in the contract, the UCC says you're going to go what's usual or ordinary in your field or line of business. That's where we get this phrase, your usual course of dealing in the trade. So if the parties don't put it in the contract, courts will say you're going to do what other electronics manufacturers typically do, how do they typically deliver goods to the buyer? Do retailers usually go and pick them up, or is delivery included, or is delivery included but is usually paid for by the retailer? You're going to have what's usual in the trade if it's not in your contract. Now, once those goods are delivered, the buyer has the right to insist that they be delivered all at one time. So let's go back to our scenario. Target orders 100 cases from Samsung. Let's say they don't put in the contract all 100 cases to be delivered FOB Greensboro by April 1st, right? It says FOB Greensboro April 1st, but it doesn't exactly specifically say that all 100 are to be delivered on that date. And Samsung decides to ship one case a day for 100 days. Target can refuse and say, no, you can't do that. Under the UCC, the buyer has the right to insist that all goods be delivered at one time, even if that's not in the contract. Buyer's duty upon receipt of goods. Once the buyer receives the goods, they have the right to examine the goods to make sure that the goods are conforming, that they're what they ordered. This is called a buyer's right of inspection. The buyer has the right to examine the goods upon tender. Remember, tender is when they're made available. So it's important you realize the buyer has the right to examine the goods upon tender means as soon as the goods are made available to them, whether they were shipped or not. So a buyer has the right to inspect the goods even if the buyer had to pick them up from the seller. The only instance in which the buyer does not have a right to inspect the goods before actual receipt of them or paying for them is in a situation where the goods are shipped COD, cash on delivery. In that instance, COD, what that means, cash on delivery, is that the buyer must pay for them, pay for the goods before they can actually accept them and examine them. But after the buyer pays for them, they can inspect them then, and if there's a problem, they'll be able to send them back in the manner they were about to discuss. Right to refuse or return the goods. Once the buyer has received the goods, or i.e. once the seller tenders the goods to the buyer, right? The buyer has the right to inspect them to make sure that they conform to the contract. And if there is anything wrong, any minuscule problem with the goods, the buyer may reject all of them or part. This is called the perfect tender rule. Samsung sends Target 100 cases of goods. Target has the warehouse guys, one of its warehouse guys, open a case when the goods come in. They inspect them. Let's say they've got 100 cases, but typically the buyer doesn't have time to inspect all 100 cases at that time. They're going to inspect a representative sample. How many that is going to be set by the company. Maybe they've decided we'll inspect 10% of whatever the shipment is. So we're going to go through 10 cases. We go through 10 cases out of 100, and in 2 of the cases we find some of the products are broken or cracked. Target has the right to reject all 100, even though they didn't check all 100 to see if they were broken. They can reject all of them, even though maybe 98 of the cases, if opened, would have been perfect. Because under the perfect tender rule, if there is anything wrong with the goods, the buyer has the right to reject all or part. So it would be Target's prerogative. They could decide, we will accept the other 98 cases, but send back these 2, or we can send back all 100. The buyer gets to make that choice per the perfect tender rule. If the buyer opens 100 cases and only finds one broken cell phone case out of 100 cases, the buyer could still reject the entire shipment under the perfect tender rule. Once the buyer has inspected the goods and they find that there are some goods that don't conform to the contract, i.e. non-conforming, they have to allow the seller to cure the defective tender, to cure the defective goods. So the buyer inspects the goods, they find that they're not conforming, they can reject them under the perfect tender rule, and then they have to give the seller time to cure, i.e. fix the shipment, fix the goods. And I want to make sure, because I keep saying shipment, even if those goods weren't shipped, if when I look at them as the buyer, inspect them and find something wrong with them, I can reject those goods and the seller have to provide new ones. They have to cure. Now, the buyer does have to make sure that they give the seller notice within a reasonable time period that they're rejecting the goods and why they're rejecting them. Buyer's duty to accept goods. Recall, once the seller tenders the goods, the buyer has the right to inspect them to make sure that they're conforming. Once they inspect them, if the goods are non-conforming in any slight way, they can reject them under the perfect tender rule. And they have to give the seller the right to cure. But let's say Target inspects 100 cases and they find, hey, these are perfect. This is exactly what we ordered. Those would be conforming goods. And a buyer has a duty to accept conforming goods. They have to accept the goods. That is one of their main responsibilities, the duties of the buyer, to accept conforming goods. And your acceptance is either express or it can be implied through a buyer's conduct or by lapse of time. So what does that mean? Express acceptance we all get, right? That's when the buyer says, yep, this is what I ordered, I'll be taking them. Implication is the buyer didn't expressly say, didn't affirmatively say that the goods were fine, but they unloaded them off the truck, put them on their shelves, put price tags on them, put them out to resale. That is implied by conduct that the buyer had accepted the goods. Similarly, lapse of time is another manner in which it appears that you plan to keep the goods. Let's say Target inspects the goods, takes them off the Samsung trucks, puts them in the warehouse, and never gets back to Samsung, doesn't inform them that there's any problem with the goods, doesn't tell them that the goods are fine. And they have them, and Target keeps the goods in their warehouse for 3 months. Through the lapse of time, they would have been deemed to have accepted those goods, even though they didn't expressly say that they were and they didn't put them out for sale. Revocation of acceptance. There are instances in which a buyer can take back, i.e. revoke their acceptance. A buyer may revoke their acceptance of goods if the goods have a substantial defect that wasn't discoverable at the time of the inspection or the time that they accepted the goods, or if the buyer had informed the seller that goods were non-conforming and gave them time to cure, but the seller never cured. So those are the two instances where a buyer can revoke an acceptance. The first one is the buyer discovers a substantial defect in the goods after they've accepted them, but it is a defect that they couldn't have discovered during their regular inspection. And it's a defect that substantially impairs the value of the contract, i.e., the goods aren't worth as much as what you paid. You're going to see that information on the note sheet that I gave you, the substantial impairment piece. Substantial defect that wasn't discoverable during the inspection, and it impairs the value of the contract. If that happens, the buyer can revoke, i.e., take back their acceptance, even though they had already communicated that they were accepting the goods. Or they can revoke an acceptance of the goods if the seller was supposed to be curing the problem and never did. Notification of the revocation of acceptance. If the buyer finds out, hey, we need to revoke, take back the acceptance because we have found that there's a problem with these goods that is substantial and we couldn't have known during our inspection, they've got to let the seller know within a reasonable time. So here's an example. Samsung sends the 100 cases of cell phones to Target. Target visually inspected the goods when they arrived, and they looked fine. The cases were fine, nothing was broken, the phones looked perfect. But after Target began selling the phones, customers began bringing the phones back saying, there's a defect, these phones don't work, the number 5 sticks, or there's some kind of problem. That is a problem that the Target could point to and say, hey, this is a substantial defect that we couldn't discover during our inspection, because inspections are just generally visual, and it significantly impairs the value of the contract. These phones aren't worth anything. They're worthless. We're having to refund the money of all our customers. They could take that information and thereby tell Samsung, we are revoking our acceptance. We're sending all 100 cases back. You're going to have to cure or give us our money back. So that's a good instance, particularly with electronics and things that you can't tell if they work just by making a visual inspection. But the buyer would have to make this revocation within a reasonable time. What's reasonable? It just depends upon the circumstances. After the buyer has informed the seller that they are revoking the goods, the buyer is supposed to hold the goods, i.e., stop using them, stop selling them, and await the seller's instructions. And what that means is about how the seller is going to get them back from them. Buyer's duty to pay. This is probably one of the most important duties of the buyer, to pay. They have to pay for the goods. The time of payment should be in the contract. The form of payment also should be in the contract. But if the parties don't put what form of payment is in the contract, the UCC says the payment will be in cash. So it behooves most buyers, if they don't want to have to pay cash, that they need to put it in the contract how they plan to pay. Then we have this issue of, well, when are duties excused? Like, when might a seller not have to deliver the goods per the contract? Or when might the buyer not have to pay? And we have this notion called commercial impracticability. This is when you've got something's happened, there's an unanticipated occurrence, there's a problem, there's a shutdown, there's a quarantine, and the people who are delivering things aren't working, and it's just commercially impossible to deliver your part of the contract. Unfortunately, we are experiencing a time in history where there's probably right now a lot of contracts where they're invoking this language, where sellers are calling up buyers and saying, I'm sorry, but we're not going to have that shipment to you because the supply chain has shut down. It is commercially unreasonable, impractical for us to get it to you. And if you've got a provision in your contract that says in situations like that, performance will be excused without any penalty, then you won't have to do anything, which is also why you get lawyers, because you want a provision like that in your contract because it saves you. Because if you don't have that in your contract, you'd legally still be required to perform. These are also called force majeure. Force, F-O-R-C-E, majeure, M-A-J-E-U-R-E. That's French. But it essentially says if things happen in life that are out of your control, where you cannot perform under the contract, your performance is excused. And those are probably, as I said, being invoked right now.